Well, hello everyone. I think we can begin. I mean, my introduction is obviously not very important, so hopefully everyone can make it in time for the presentation. But hi, I'm Maggie. I'm the president of the Human Rights Club here at Simon's Rock, and today we're honored to welcome Scott Langley, who is a photojournalist and activist on the death penalty. Um, Scott has worked taking photos of events around executions, has worked as an advocate against the death penalty, and has given presentations, talks, and shown his work all across the world and throughout the US. I want to hand it over to Scott here soon, but just a few things like this is about the death penalty, so obviously it involves death and execution, so consider yourself warned on that front, and please be um, please have some basic etiquette when it comes to Zoom and stay muted when you aren't talking. Um, yeah, Scott, if you're ready, you can begin whenever you'd
Great.
like. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. I guess one other Zoom etiquette thing, I pressed record on my computer to record this session. Just for the part where I show my photos and am talking about them, it's not the recording that I use isn't going to show anyone's name or faces that's on the call. So hopefully that's okay with everyone, respecting people's privacy and whatnot. So just wanted a heads up about that. I'm honored to be here. This is kind of roughly in conjunction with a week of Amnesty International action on the death penalty. I live in New York State, just on the Massachusetts-New York border, and New York State leaders wanted to organize something around the death penalty for this week. And so we created this week of action, and we've had different programs every day this week around the death penalty in terms of educating people. We brought in a death row exoneree to speak. We had a lobby training, all these different elements. We had a vigil yesterday for death row, and I gave a presentation to the Boston University Amnesty Club on Wednesday night. And it's the similar presentation that I'll be doing here today with you. So it's great that this is kind of a part of this week of action where people all over, not just our region, but the entire country. There have been people joining these calls also from internationally. I saw people from Germany and Switzerland and different places. So it's been really exciting to see kind of this rebirth of interest and activism on the death penalty. Because here in the Northeast, I don't know how where you all are from originally, or where your homes are, but in the Northeast, there actually is no death penalties in any of the states. Massachusetts got rid of the death penalty like in the 1980s. Where I live in New York, we got rid of it in the early 2000s. And New Hampshire was the only remaining Northeastern state for many years that had the death penalty. And they abolished it 2 years ago in 2019. So we're a death penalty free state. So often with Amnesty International, it's kind of hard to get people interested in the issue because it's not something that really kind of hits home for us. Because if it's not something that we're facing or affected by, it's harder to mobilize around, right? Because it's not like the premier issue that Amnesty is promoting or that people are necessarily thinking about. If you live in a state like Texas or Georgia or Tennessee, where executions are happening on a regular basis, Amnesty tends to want to mobilize and work more in those areas because it's real and it's urgent and it's right there in the community. But here in the Northeast, it's been more of a challenge. But what happened to kind of reignite all this was that not only does each state have the death penalty, but the federal government also has its own death penalty. And also the military does too. There's kind of these two branches. The states have the death penalty, and then the federal government has a death penalty, and that includes a military death penalty. And for the last 47 years, there have only been 3 federal executions. So it was a very rare thing. Those happened in the early 2000s. They started in 2001 when the government executed Timothy McVeigh for his role in the bombing of the Oklahoma City building. That killed over 100 people. And there was a couple more federal executions shortly after that. But then there was a lull of 17 years where the federal death penalty wasn't reactivated. And then under former President Donald Trump, he took it upon himself to reestablish the federal death penalty as an active process of executing federal prisoners. And so in Trump's last 6 months of office, he oversaw the execution of 13 people, 12 men and 1 woman, to take them out of their federal death row, which is in Indiana, and execute them. And so this was something that really kind of woke people up, and that's the impetus that brought us to want to do something this week to take action in the Northeast. Because even though we don't have the death penalty here in the Northeast, we are still it's still a threat to us, because the federal government can pursue the death penalty no matter where we live. It doesn't matter if your state has a death penalty or doesn't have the death penalty. The federal government can override that and pursue the death sentence. In case in point, Massachusetts has had 2 death penalty trials and 2 death penalty convictions where the person was sent to death row, just in the last 20 years, even though the state hasn't had the death penalty itself in more than 40. So the federal government and the federal death penalty is a threat to us in the Northeast, and that's really a reason why I think people are wanting to do things. So I appreciate your interest in the topic, given this kind of renewed urgency of knowing what the federal government is capable of. And fortunately, President Biden has said that he's not going to use the federal death penalty. And hopefully that was just an abnormality that happened under President Trump, but you never know. And so Malachi is going to talk later about what we can do to ensure that this doesn't happen, not just under Biden's presidency, but future presidents. And so we'll go into that later. So I do a lot of different kinds of presentations around the death penalty for groups, kind of based on the time that's available and the interest. And I talked to Malachi before about kind of what would fit your interest and your structure for today. And we decided that I would share a bit of my photography work around the death penalty, because in addition to my volunteer roles in Amnesty International death penalty coordinator, I also have been a photojournalist on the issue for more than 20 years. And I've been taking my camera with me to all the events I go to and taking photos to use those to bring back to people and show them what's happening out there around the death penalty. Because not all of us are going to prisons, we're not going to execution vigils, we're not going to the marches and the protests and the conferences. And so I kind of took it upon myself as a way to really show people what is happening in the movement around the death penalty, the movement to abolish the death penalty, and the actual carrying out of executions and what that's like in our country. And so what I'm going to talk about and share with you here is mostly about that experience that I've had of traveling around the country and documenting the death penalty as an independent human rights photojournalist. And it's always cool to talk to students about this project, because the idea and the project actually was born out of my college experience. I took a class in college where it was a human rights class, and we had to do an art project for the class. And what I ended up doing was going down to the death house where I grew up in Texas. And so executions were happening so regularly there that I only had to wait a few days before one was scheduled, unfortunately. There was one happening a week at this time. And so for my art project for this class, I decided to go stand outside the prison, take some photos of whatever was happening on the outside. I assumed people would be vigiling or protesting, holding signs or candles. I didn't really know, because I'd never been to a vigil outside of a prison for an execution before. And so I just went to take photos for this art project for this class. And I also ended up going back a few months later, even after the class was over, to stand outside of that same prison again during execution, because that experience had really changed how I viewed the death penalty. I had a real strong academic grasp around what the death penalty meant. I knew its problems. I knew about the race problems, the class problems, the human rights conflicts. I knew that it was targeting innocent people and poor people, and it was an expensive process. I knew all these things in this like kind of abstract academic approach, but I didn't really feel in my heart anything about it. It was just this very kind of dry academic perspective, I guess I would say. But it was that process of standing outside of a prison and having the death penalty become real to me is what really shaped me. Because I'm guessing most of you don't know this, but like when you're standing in a place and you can pinpoint the exact time and the exact moment, the exact manner that someone's going to die, it's mind numbing, because I stood there on the street corner across from the prison, knowing that literally across the street from where I stood, a human being's life was being taken. And I'd never been in that situation before because it was so premeditated. And I felt so helpless. There was nothing I can do. There was no way I was going to get into the prison and stop what was happening. That's not going to happen. It's, surrounded by police and doors and bars and all of these things. But I had this experience of seeing the death penalty is real and understanding that it impacts real human beings and real families. One of the executions that I was outside the prison for, the mother of the man being executed wasn't inside the prison watching her son's execution, where she was allowed to, but she didn't want to do that. She stood outside the prison to hold vigil with the rest of us. And so I stood just yards away from this mother at the moment of her son's execution. And there's nothing more heart-wrenching than seeing that, to see a mother weeping, crying out for her son, knowing what was happening across the street. And to be in that situation really is this transformative, powerful moment that led me to not only believe the death penalty was wrong, but want to help people like that mother who were having to stand by helplessly while the government killed her son. It wanted me to help the death row prisoners themselves who were suffering on the inside. And so I began organizing and working and wanting to do more and volunteering with Amnesty International. And as I said, to pick up my camera and to document what I was seeing in this process, because I knew that if people could see what I was seeing, that their hearts and minds would be changed as well. And I ran across a quote from Albert Camus in the early years of this process that really spoke to me, because it describes really exactly what I'm hoping to accomplish by taking photos of what I see and bringing those to people. And his quote is this. He said, "It would become harder to execute men one after another, as is done in our country today, if those executions were translated into vivid images in the popular imagination." So the idea being that if people could see what was happening with the executions of his time, that he believed people wouldn't support it anymore. And really, that's kind of my goal as a journalist and as an activist. So there's a lot more I could say about my background. I've traveled all over the country. I've been abroad. I've been to Europe. I've been to Africa. I've been documenting the death penalty widely for 20 years. And so what I've done is created this PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to walk you through. And I'm going to show you photos that I've been taking in these 20 years of my work. But there's a few kind of preface statements that I wanted to make before I start the slideshow of this. First of all, the way I'm going to present these photos is presented as a photo narrative. I'm going to show you photos that I've taken and accompanied by words. And these words that I'm sharing and these experiences I'm sharing are all things that I've either heard on the ground where I've been in these events, things I've witnessed with my own eyes, and also some things that I've read in the news after the fact. And pretty much all this narrative I'm sharing is both from inside and outside of a prison. And I also often use the words of the wardens in the prisons themselves to describe what happens on an execution night. So all these photos are ones that I've personally taken. As I said, they're from all over the country, other countries also. Nothing has been staged, nothing's manipulated. None of these are meant to be representative or symbolic. And I'm merging these photos together from all those different locations and different executions and different vigils and different environments to tell one cohesive story. And this is a blend of my training as a sociologist, which is what I studied in school, and also my work as an activist and a photojournalist. And it's important to note that cameras, either photography cameras or video cameras, are not actually allowed in prisons during executions. So you'll actually never see photos of executions or video of executions actually happening in modern times. So what I've created here is really kind of the closest that we can get to that experience through visually through these photos. So in this presentation, I'm going to be telling the story of what happens on an execution night in the United States. And I'll be using an actual case of a prisoner named Troy Davis, kind of as this storyline thread throughout the narrative they're going to share. So I'm going to share my desktop here now. Now I've given you that little background to what this is, so that we can see some of these images as I'm talking about. So hold on one second. All right. I'm assuming everyone can see the photo here. All right, and I'm just gonna cover my lens of my camera because I really want people to focus on the images of what I'm going to be showing here in the presentation. Okay, so as I said, the storyline that I'm going to share is based on a case of a man named Troy Davis. And just really briefly about who Troy Davis was in his case. Troy Davis was sentenced to death in Savannah, Georgia in 1989 for the killing of a 27-year-old off-duty police officer named Mark Allen McPhail Sr. Troy, a young Black man, was convicted based purely on the testimony of 9 non-police witnesses at trial. There was no DNA evidence. There was no murder weapon tied to the crime. The only evidence that there was this one eyewitness who said that she could identify him. And not only this one eyewitness, but there was 8 others, 9 in total. And that was the only thing that the prosecution had to convict Troy Davis. Over the course of time, while Troy sat on death row, it was revealed through investigation that 7 out of those 9 eyewitnesses who testified at trial, they all recanted their testimony. They all said, you know, the 7 out of the 9 said they actually didn't know who killed the officer. And some even said that they were bullied or forced by the police into giving false testimony. And when asked who the real killer was, many of those 7 pointed to another man who just happened to be one of the 2 witnesses who did not recant their testimony. So a little suspicious. And then there was ultimately this very serious and convincing case of innocence that grabbed the world's attention in the 2000s. So the second preface of my presentation that I wanted to mention, to kind of address the true complexity of the death penalty, is to acknowledge that this work as a journalist falls short, and it's not a complete documentary that fully shows both sides of the issue. As with every story about the death penalty, it always starts with a murder and thus a victim. Because for a state to give the death penalty, there has to be a murder involved. So there's always a grieving family left behind. In the case of Officer McPhail in the Troy Davis case, the officer left behind not only a wife, but he had 2 young children, a 1-year-old Madison and an infant son, Mark Jr. And here are those 2 children, now grown up, obviously, 21 years later after the murder of their father. They're here at a vigil for fallen police officers. Their story and the story of their family and the stories of 19,000 people murdered in 2020 alone, it's a significantly important story to hear and to understand. Violence and homicide are absolutely an epidemic in our country that affects so many people each year. But I'm not here to tell that story. I'm here to tell the story that begins at the end of the road and what happens after a murder takes place and someone is given the death penalty. I say the end of the road because an execution and the death penalty process, for that matter, is the last chapter in a very, very long and tragic tale. To truly talk about crime and punishment would take all day to tell this whole story, because we have to talk about drug and alcohol addiction. You know, why are people committing murder in the first place? We have to talk about untreated mental illness and poverty and gangs and gun control and just the culture of violence that we live in, to where we have 19,000 people murdered a year in this country. There's so much to talk about before we even get to an execution. But our time this afternoon is short and the stories are complex. So what we're going to focus on is the final chapter, as that's the story that my photos seek to tell, because that story too is a very important story. And so here we begin. Here is where the part of the story starts around the death penalty. A prisoner who has been given the death penalty for murder spends their time on their state's death row. After a number of legal appeals are filed in the courts and eventually denied, a death warrant will be issued and an execution date set. This process may take as many as 10 to 15 years or more. While on death row, prisoners are confined to a 7 by 15-foot prison cell for as many as 23 hours a day, with little or no outside recreation time. The narrow slits of window at the top of their cells are often their only glimpse into the outside world. On the other side of the prison compound is the state's execution facility, also called the death house. Inside of the death house is the execution chamber. Here in this photo, the execution chamber is on the second floor of the building, in the area where there are no windows. It is in this place that a prisoner will be brought for execution when the time comes. A few days prior to the execution, the prisoner will be transferred from death row to a special area called Death Watch. It is called Death Watch because the prisoner is under constant supervision to make sure that they do not commit suicide before they are taken out. While on death row, these final days are broken up with periodic visits by family, friends, and attorneys. For all those years on death row, visits took place where the visitor is separated from the prisoner by thick glass. However, on the very day of execution, the family and friends will be allowed to hug and touch the prisoner for the first time since their initial arrest. This final physical contact visit may last up to 4 hours. Then the family and friends will not see the prisoner again until the time of execution, if it is even allowed by the warden. After visitation ends, family, friends, and attorneys wait in a nearby fast food restaurant across the street. They sit and they wait, hoping for news of clemency by the governor or a stay of execution from a high court. At this very same time, the prisoner will sit here for their final meal, a meal that often includes anything they want to eat within reason. Some prisoners order a feast, some choose to fast, and some mentally ill prisoners have reportedly asked to save their leftovers to eat later. After the final meal, the prisoner is allowed to make a few final phone calls to family under close supervision by a guard in the nearby monitoring booth. On the other end of the phone, families say goodbye. Here, Troy Davis's mother, Virginia, retreats to the far corner of the nearby restaurant to speak to her son. A final, heartbreaking goodbye that echoed in the stillness of the heavy moment. Troy's mom then gathers on the prison grounds to stand witness against her son's execution, surrounded by comforting friends and supporters. In this particular case, Troy's family were not allowed to witness the execution itself, and they had to stay outside with the protest group. In 90 minutes from this moment, the execution was to be carried out. I say was in the past tense because at that very moment, word arrives to the gathered crowd that the US Supreme Court has stayed the execution. The execution would not happen today, nor would it happen until the new evidence of his innocence could be heard in a court of law. Troy's sister, Martina, at the far right, wipes away tears of relief, while Reverend Al Sharpton in the center, who is Troy's spiritual advisor, beams a smile directly at Troy's mom. It's a victory. The day ends with a prayer circle to give thanks for the courts doing the right thing, and with hope that Troy would soon be freed from prison when the new evidence was heard. So Troy returns to his bed on death row, and he waits. After 2 years of waiting, Troy finally has his day in court. Troy's family and supporters, including presidents of the NAACP and Amnesty International, approach a Georgia courthouse to attend the court hearing, a hearing to bring to light the fact that Georgia had convicted the wrong person based on those 7 eyewitnesses who lied at trial. The world's attention turned to the plight of Troy Davis after his near-miss execution that was stayed only 90 minutes before being carried out. The media was swarming events like this hearing. With the efforts of Troy's family and many national and international organizations, the world was paying attention. Over the course of these few years, over 1 million people, including well-known politicians, judges, government figureheads, including those from the FBI, signed a petition calling on the state of Georgia to spare an innocent man's life. But a year later, the judge in the case released his ruling that he decided the evidence was not enough to stop the execution. A new death warrant was issued, an execution date set yet again. The news shocked the world, and it shocked the family. Troy's mother, Virginia, who was in otherwise good health, died within weeks of the announcement. The stress and emotional roller coaster had taken its toll. Execution day. Amnesty International's executive director pauses to collect himself in the foyer of a church across from the prison where Troy is scheduled to be put to death at 7 p.m. that evening. Rallies and protests were held everywhere from state houses around the country to U.S. embassies abroad. Thousands of people had marched in the streets of Georgia and all across the world in the days leading up to the execution. The consensus was that an innocent man was once again about to be executed. Press conferences were held to encourage the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, the governor, and even the president of the United States to step in, but none did. At 4 p.m., in a final press conference at the church across from the prison, Troy's family gathered to make a final plea for their brothers, their uncles, their family members' life. Troy's outspoken sister, Martina, who had been recently hospitalized from a battle with cancer, rose to her feet out of her wheelchair during the press conference and said, "I stand here today to tell you, I am Troy Davis. You are Troy Davis. We are Troy Davis." It was a battle cry of solidarity because justice was at stake. All of us were in this together. Across the street at the prison, people began to gather and protest. Buses of people from all over Georgia were arriving, carrying signs, banners, and hopeful energy that once again there would be a stay. At the execution date last time, there were perhaps 50 protesters there. This time there were far, far more. Some media reports said as many as 1,000. Armed police teams worked to intimidate the crowds, telling people they couldn't be there, threatening peaceful protesters with guns and with arrest. Eventually, due to the vast numbers of people descending on the area, the police relent and allow for protesters to stand along the highway across from the prison. A small group of about 50 people were allowed on the prison grounds themselves, with a strict no cameras and no photography policy. And the rest of the crowds were behind police tape and guarded heavily. SWAT team members and several other law enforcement agencies showed full force to prevent any disruption of the execution. In acts of civil disobedience and resistance, some protesters crossed the yellow police tape into the street, only to be thrown to the ground and arrested immediately. A scene not unique to this particular execution. In states like Texas and North Carolina, people have been arrested for simple acts of conscience and peaceful disobedience. Others engaged in creative forms of protest, highlighting issues such as the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. In rare cases, some even take up arms in the fight against the death penalty, militantly taking to the streets. Of course, not everyone outside the prison is against what is happening on the inside. Here at Troy Davis's execution, 2 people gathered to support Troy's killing. Some come out to support the execution, citing Christian principles of the Old Testament, including someone recently at the federal executions that just took place. And some come to argue that some people who commit murder deserve what they have coming to them. Back inside the prison, about 3 hours before the time of the 7 p.m. execution, the prison warden supervises the transportation of the prisoner out of the death watch area into a preparation room. Here, the prisoner is stripped down to their underwear, and arms, legs, and chest are strapped to the gurney. Then a single white sheet is laid over the body. The warden takes the last statement from the prisoner, which will be transcribed and released later to the media. After the last statement, the chaplain or spiritual advisor is brought in to be with the prisoner until it is time to be taken into the death chamber. Prison staff began moving the witnesses of the execution from a waiting area toward the execution chamber. Witnesses of the execution are brought into the viewing room 10 minutes before 7 o'clock. The room is able to hold 2 rows of 4 chairs each. It is in this small space that the victim's family, the prisoner's support, the media, attorneys, and police will all witness. On average, there may be 16 people. So with just 8 chairs, many will stand along the walls. At this time, the warden instructs the witnesses that everyone must act in a professional manner. There will be no talking, no crying, no outbursts, nor any other sign of emotion during the carrying out of the death sentence, which will be viewed closely through the window straight ahead. After the final visit with the prison chaplain, with 5 minutes to go, the gurney is wheeled from the preparation room into the adjacent death chamber. The gurney and the prisoner are placed at the viewing window, eye level with the witnesses on the other side of the double-paned windows and cinder-blocked walls. The prison staff wait for the final phone call to know that the execution has been cleared to start. Here, just 3 minutes before 7 o'clock, Troy Davis's nephew, Dejan, is surrounded by supporters outside the prison grounds as he looks towards the sky, thinking of his uncle on the inside. A clock inside a death house waiting room strikes 7. At the very moment that Troy Davis is scheduled for execution, friends and supporters begin hugging each other, shedding tears of cries, of sorrow and pain, some collapsing to the ground in screams of disbelief. Then suddenly at 7:01, it is announced that the US Supreme Court has stopped the execution. A man reacts to the news while on live TV behind journalist Amy Goodman. Unbelievable excitement spreads throughout the crowd with a roar heard like none other, erupting across from the prison where 1,000 voices fill the air. Those previous tears of sorrow turn into tears of joy. However, it is soon learned that the court has simply delayed the execution. They have not stopped it like last time, 3 years earlier. People face the prison in prayer and silent meditation while waiting on news of what is to come. At 7:30 that evening, the sun sets over the crowd on the prison grounds, while the thousands stay strong across the street. The glare of the television lights illuminate the area with live coverage in this historic moment. At 8:15, Troy's teenage nephew Dejan and his young niece Kirsten play, while other family members look on. As the hours pass, optimism is maintained, but still no word about Troy's fate. At 9 o'clock, there's still no new information, and on the outside, organizers lead those gathered in spiritual song and in prayer. And then the news comes. At 10:20, in a waiting room of the prison, it is announced that the Supreme Court has lifted the delay. Attorneys react to the news, knowing that all hope is lost. The execution will go forward. Outside the prison, organizers and pastors standing over Troy's sister Martina and other family members share the dire news from the inside. At 11:08, Troy's sister Martina looks toward the prison, knowing that the execution is most likely underway by this time. Gathered around her are friends and supporters as a quiet lull of disbelief permeates the area. Back inside the prison, once again, the warden wheels the prisoner and the gurney into the death chamber and places him at the viewing window. Once the prisoner is in place, a curtain is pulled to divide the death chamber into 2 parts. On one side, the prisoner and the witness viewing window. On the other side, an anonymous 3-person execution team. Now, this is the part that no one ever sees, not even the witnesses. But we know from released reports that the following has happened, not in Troy's experience specifically, but in other actual executions. Just before the prisoner is brought into the death chamber behind this curtain, back when he was strapped to the gurney in the preparation room, IV catheters were started, 1 in each arm. Members of the execution team spent 24 minutes trying to get an IV into the prisoner's left arm. Ultimately unsuccessful, they try to set another line in the right arm. They spend 8 minutes on the right arm before going back to the left for another attempt. That still doesn't work. So the team calls for the help of a doctor, who is present to monitor the prisoner's vital signs during the execution. The doctor spends 13 minutes setting an IV near the groin, which execution protocol says is a last result if lines in the arm are not possible. After 54 minutes of this, the injection system is finally set in place and the prisoner is brought to that viewing window. At the signal of the warden, a series of 3 drugs are administered into the IV lines by the hidden execution team. The first drug puts the prisoner to sleep. The second is a paralyzing agent. The third and final dose is a deadly chemical that stops the heart. Sometimes the drugs work quickly and the prisoner will simply close their eyes and drift away. At other times, there are problems and there will be thrashing and gasps. 17 minutes later, a doctor monitoring an EKG machine from a nearby room emerges to pronounce the prisoner dead. Outside the prison, family of the prisoner weep, comforting and holding each other in this dark hour. In this horrific scene, outside of the prison another time in Georgia, a prisoner's young daughter hysterically screaming, "Daddy, Daddy," over and over and over. Witnesses of the execution exit the prison to attend a press conference in a nearby waiting room. A representative of the prison announces the time of death and releases the final statement. Media witnesses share their notes detailing the timeline of events and how the prisoner responded to the drugs. Exiting the prison, the prisoner's personal spiritual advisor recounts the experience of standing next to the gurney, watching a man die, while victim families, witnesses laugh and applaud from the viewing room. Then the body of the prisoner is loaded into a white coroner's van, which will go directly to a nearby hospital for examination and notice from the office of the chief medical examiner. At the hospital, a death certificate is issued, and in section 21C, the prison doctor has indicated manner of death as a homicide, the only of those available categories most appropriate. Back at the prison, empty tissue boxes are left behind in the waiting room, and another body is laid to rest. While you may think nights like this are rare because we aren't hearing about them on a regular basis on our news, it's all actually quite common. The story I've just shared usually happens anywhere from 1 to 3 times each month. However, in the last year, things have slowed down dramatically because of the pandemic. But to date, there have been a total of 1,532 executions, nights like this. There have been 3 federal executions this year, and there are 5 state executions scheduled in the coming months, despite the pandemic continuing. The next one is April 20th in Texas. And there will be more to come, as there are 2,500 men and women on death row today, awaiting their execution dates in various states, as well as on the federal and military death rows. The death penalty is, by all accounts, in decline. Less than half of the states currently use the death penalty in law or practice, but it does still persist. And it is still just as devastating to those who go through that timeline narrative each time an execution takes place, regardless of if the mainstream media is or is not paying attention, and regardless as if there are 6 people or 600 people outside the prison protesting. So I want to back up and give you some deeper context to the few of the photos I showed you earlier, and touch on a couple of important issues relevant to where the death penalty is today before we move into some Q&A. I showed this as the final image in that timeline narrative. This is an actual gravesite of an executed prisoner in a Texas Department of Corrections cemetery. When a family member of an executed prisoner cannot afford to pay for a burial, the state of Texas offers this option. The stone cross grave marker indicates that an unclaimed prisoner body was buried on September 10th, 1999. The prisoner was number 999107. The X before the prisoner number simply indicates that they were executed by the state. No name is anywhere to be found. When it comes to the actual lethal injection process in this country, I said earlier that after that third and final injection, the prisoner was pronounced dead 17 minutes later. That is increasingly not the case, nor the norm. Often the fatal drug used has been potassium chloride in the past. But since now most pharmaceutical companies are refusing to sell drugs to prisons for execution purposes, the prisons may resort to using experimental drugs acquired from foreign labs or through illegal channels because of a shortage. These drugs are untested on humans and dangerously risky. Depending on which drug is used, it can take up to 2 hours before a prisoner is killed. In recent in cases in Oklahoma, Arizona, and Ohio, it has been reported that prisoners appeared to be under great pain during that process. In some cases, executions have been halted midway because the drugs were not performing as expected, which has ignited a national conversation regarding the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And while lethal injection is the most common method of execution, I do want to point out there are actually 5 methods of execution that are still legally allowed in this country today. There's death by lethal injection, which is the most common and the most used. It's allowed in all 28 states that still have the death penalty and was last used 6 weeks ago by the federal government. Death by hanging is still allowed in 3 states, but it hasn't been used since 1996 in Delaware. This is a photo from someone's Halloween display in their yard in Texas, an effigy of a black man hanging from a tree. Death by gassing, it's still legal in 7 states, but it actually hasn't been used since 1999 in Arizona. Death by electrocution in the electric chair, it's still allowed in 9 states and was last used in just February of last year, a year ago in Tennessee. And death by firing squad, it's still legal in 3 states and was last used in Utah in 2010, so not that long ago. In pictures, my friend Randy Gardner holding the autopsy photo from when his brother was that last person shot to death by the federal government on death row. While some of these methods are increasingly uncommon, they're still legal, and most have happened in our lifetimes, and it's expanding. Recently, states like Tennessee and Oklahoma have added gassing and firing squad to their laws in the face of the lethal injection drug shortage. And just this week alone, South Carolina, the Senate passed a bill to add firing squad to the South Carolina execution protocol. So this photo that I used here to represent the gas chamber was actually taken at a concentration camp in Germany. I mentioned this because we cannot talk about the death penalty without putting it into a historical international human rights context. Us Amnesty members know that's so important. The technology and methodology and the protocol of carrying out executions in the United States today is a direct product of the Nazi death camps of Europe. Since that time, the world has overwhelmingly renounced the power of the state to kill human beings. In fact, using the death penalty is now a violation of every major international treaty and international law. Yet the United States still uses it, and more frequently than the vast majority of other countries. Worldwide, 70% of all countries have abolished the death penalty, either in law or in practice. In countries like Uganda, with male death row prisoners pictured here, they have a death row, but they no longer execute prisoners. On average, 2 countries a year are getting rid of the death penalty. In the last 10 years, we've seen Congo, Kenya, Liberia, Mexico, Turkey, Rwanda, Argentina, Uzbekistan, Guinea, and more, the list goes on, have gotten rid of the death penalty. This photo shows Amnesty International students in New York City, outside of the Russian consulate, calling on Russia to end the death penalty. This is one of the many signs that they were carrying that listed the nearly 150 countries that don't use the death penalty. So you may ask, who are the ones who are continuing to execute if so many have gotten rid of it? For a while now, the United States has always ranked in the top 10 of countries in the total number of executions carried out each year. The only people listed with us and before us in that top 10 are China, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And on any given time, it might be North Korea, Yemen, Somalia, Vietnam, or Sudan. This is the company we keep. We're the only country in the Americas and the only Western democracy in the world that still retains this practice. In this photo taken in 2000, the KKK was rallying in support of executing Gary Graham. He was a 17-year-old black man in Texas who allegedly killed a white man named Bobby Lambert. At trial, Gary Graham had a nearly all-white jury and was given a death sentence despite no murder weapon, no fingerprints, and only one eyewitness who said she could identify him from across a dark parking lot in the night. He pleaded innocence all the way to his death. If there's anything to highlight the racism inherent in the death penalty, white men in KKK gowns speak for itself. And as a footnote, 5 years after Graham was executed, the US Supreme Court declared it's unconstitutional to execute juvenile offenders like Gary Graham, who was just 17 at the time of the crime. But what has been done is done. There is no reversing an execution. And that is a growing problem, as we know for a fact that innocent people like Troy Davis have been executed for crimes they did not commit. And Troy and Gary are not alone. There are many, many others. And so many more have had disturbingly close calls. The following photos are just a handful of the 185 men and women who have been exonerated from death row because of their actual innocence. The ratio now stands that for every 8 people executed in this country, 1 person is legally found to be innocent and is freed. 1 in 8. Some exonerees have spent more than 30 years awaiting their executions, sometimes having had come within hours of the actual process, only to be declared innocent and released. Human lives that were almost taken by the system because the government made a mistake, or perhaps intentionally falsified a case against them, or hid, or even destroyed evidence. Which begs a very important moral question. If these people had been executed wrongfully, would it still have been worth it in order to punish the truly guilty? In my work, I've spent a lot of time with some of these men and women. I've heard them tell their stories day after day to audience after audience. While the stories themselves are hard to listen to and will bring anyone to a maddening anger at the system, what always hits me the hardest is when I see the grown men cry. Telling their story never gets any easier for them. The wounds sometimes never heal. This photo shows a tearful Kwame Ajamu being surrounded by other death row exonerees after telling his story of being sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit and spending 28 years in prison. I initially said I wasn't here to tell the story of the victims and the justice that the families of the victims deserve and seek, but I do want to mention one particular person because he had a profound impact on me in my early years of this work. This is Bud Welch. And here he holds a photo of his 24-year-old daughter, Julie, who was killed along with the 167 others by Timothy McVeigh in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Bud says that the term closure is a myth, and nothing will end his pain and his anger, not even the execution of Timothy McVeigh. He campaigns internationally for an end to the death penalty, arguing that the false promise of closure from the state only causes the families of the victims to suffer more. Through the death penalty, the families are forced to relive their pain and loss every time the prisoner has a legal appeal, and then again when the person is executed and the media rehashes the murder and the story of what happened. Their healing process is continually interrupted and often drags on for decades. And not only are the families of the victims grieving, but the families of those still on death row fight for their loved ones' lives. Here gathered are family of death row prisoners, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, weeping because they cannot hug and comfort those they love so much. They seek support in a society that has demonized not only their loved one, but them too. I showed this photo during the narrative earlier as well. This is the new Black Panther Party taking to the streets, armed with automatic weapons aimed into the crowd at times. Their cause was to protest against Gary Graham's execution, that same one where the KKK was, protesting in support of that 17-year-old Black man who was unconstitutionally executed. During the protest, the Panthers climbed on top of a car in the downtown area, and they threatened to shoot any white media in retaliation if the state carried out the execution. I was actually right at their feet when this was said. You can imagine that I moved quickly. I took this photo on the way out from the back. You can see the other white female journalist on the right, looking over her shoulder for her exit as well. The execution went forward, as I mentioned, but thankfully, those threats were empty. In that experience, however, I asked, what does the death penalty teach us? That killing is an appropriate response to killing? That retaliatory violence is an acceptable means of addressing conflict? It is clear that it's an endless cycle, regardless if it's the Black Panthers threatening it or our own criminal justice system and government. And so what does this teach us as a society? And what does it teach our children who watch what goes on? In the crowd at Graham's execution, with the KKK on one side and the Black Panthers on the other, this young girl clenches her toy gun, observing the drama in the streets. But while the drama is rarely in the streets, it is carried out in the dead of night behind secure prison walls, while victims' families desperately seek closure, while prisoner families prepare for loss, and so that the rest of us can supposedly sleep safely at night. That is the intersection of state and justice in this story. As says these crossroads in Indiana, just down the road from the federal death row, in the hours before Timothy McVeigh's federal execution, a sign I stood under just weeks ago during Trump's final executions of his term. All right, so my PowerPoint presentation of photos ends there. I always try and keep it under an hour because I know it's a lot to digest, and there's a lot of heavy topics because when we're talking about the death penalty, it's about real lives and real human rights violations among our prisoners in this country. But I know that sometimes people have questions after I do a presentation, and so wanted to leave space for that to happen. And wanted to open it up to you all to ask anything that you wanted. I'm more than happy to entertain questions if you have questions about specific photos that I showed or experiences that I've had, or if you're looking to get some more information about where we stand with the death penalty today in terms of statistics that I didn't cover already, or the trends of where things are going. I know Malachi is going to get to talking about some of the federal work that Amnesty International is engaged on that I referred to at the beginning. So we'll get to that part about what you can do and kind of where things are with that. But just wanted to open it up for people that, and if you just want to share your own thoughts or opinions, that's welcome here too as well. Because as I mentioned before, I wasn't necessarily on this page where I am now when I first learned about the death penalty, and that's okay. It's something that we're all thinking of and some of us struggling with because it does have a lot of weight to it in terms of how it affects the victims and the families and of that nature. So it's a safe space to share and talk about it in however way you want to. So we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. That was so important. And I don't want to say wonderful to hear, but I really appreciated it. And
Sure.
it really, it felt very important to me. I guess my main question is what it's like to be that close to someone's dying. Like, what is the emotional toll and what is the emotional slash physical reaction to that? Like, I think I heard a photographer or journalist witness once who said that when they were witnessing the execution, they told the warden that they had to like resist in some way, even though it was futile. I was wondering what your experience with that was like. And
Yeah, I think, if we're not the people that are directly affected, like it's not our family member being executed, or if it's, not our loved one that was the person who was murdered in the case, we have, obviously a very different experience than the people who are most intimately involved with what's happening. But I think from, the outsider's experience, there's different levels to it. I've never witnessed an execution itself, but I've heard from some of the media who just witnessed some of the federal executions that have just taken place in the last 6 months. And some of them, they're having nightmares. They're suffering from PTSD. Some of them have gone into therapy from that experience of actually being in the room and watching an execution carried out. So it's very traumatic for people. But as I said, I haven't been in the room myself during an execution. The photos I showed were done on media tours before executions happened, so there's not prisoners present. But standing outside of a prison, it still has that traumatizing experience. And, for me, it really depends on kind of the level of exposure. So the very first execution I ever stood outside of, it was just people vigiling. No one there had any relationship with the victim's family or the prisoner. And while it was a powerful experience to know that I was that close to what was happening, behind these barbed wire fences and prison brick walls, that experience, while traumatizing, isn't nearly the same as when you're standing there and the mother of the prisoner is crying or the daughter of the prisoner is screaming. When you see those things, that's when it really hits you the hardest, because it comes even more real and more emotional. And it's hard for me on those experiences where I see those tears and that trauma in the eyes of the people directly affected. I also have nightmares. During that Troy Davis execution, we really believed it was not going to happen. We really did. Amnesty International and all the organizations did everything right. It was like probably the most successful, in the sense, organizing campaign that I've ever seen around the death penalty, yet it still happened. And that defeat is traumatizing. Being around, Troy's sister and his nephew was traumatizing. And it's still hard for me to look at those photos. I woke up crying in the middle of the night after that execution because I was having these nightmares about it. And it's hard for me to see those photos. I do this presentation, not really looking at the photos that I'm showing you. I'm, keying through them on my keyboard, but I'm focused on the words, because seeing the photos themselves bring up so much emotion for me. And it takes me back to that moment of what it was like to be there. So it's hard, and it requires self-care. And being attentive to what our limitations are as activists, because if we completely overload and overwhelm ourselves with the atrocities that we work on as Amnesty advocates and activists, it's a lot, and we have to really keep an eye on that. And we all have our ways of coping and dealing, and that's important. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm used to people not having questions, because I think it's definitely something that people need to sit with and to digest. So no offense taken if people don't have anything to say, but if you do, you're welcome to. And I'm going to drop my email into the chat too while we're here, just because maybe something comes up for you later that you want to ask about. I'm always happy to talk. All right, put my email there, and I have a website also of my photos from this project. It's not currently mobile friendly, because it's an old site. I'm actually in the process of working it. You can still see it, but it's not as good as it'll be. Hopefully, in by the April 1st, it's going to be relaunched to be mobile friendly and updated with new work, because I'm constantly taking new photos for the project. As I mentioned, I was in Indiana I was actually there for 6 out of the last 13 federal executions, and so there's new portions of the work that will be on my website. And I am on social media. I think right now just on Facebook actually, but I post newer stuff on Facebook. So from my website link that I'm sending out here, you can find me on Facebook, so that you can see what I'm up to and other engagements. All right, so put that there, make sure these are in. All right, so that's there for you. So definitely reach out.
And I just want to bring attention to what Rowan said before they left. They had to leave. This was so informative and honestly horrifying to hear. These are things that I don't think I would have learned anywhere else. Thank you so much. And I totally reflect that sentiment as well. It was uh, such a uncomfortable truth to confront, and I'm so glad we all had that opportunity. Um, uh, well, I wanna, of course, make sure everyone who wanted to ask a question has the opportunity to, not to extend this too uncomfortably long. I guess I will turn to the political action that can be taken. And on the federal level, that is mostly concerned with two bills that have been proposed in the House by Representative um, Ayanna Pressley and Adriano Es- uh,
Espiat.
Espiat. Sorry. Um, yeah. And I am attaching a Google Sheets in the chat, or not attaching, sending it out with all of the Northeast House representatives in it with their position, specifically to three people who I know who are in this meeting, me, Sophie, and um, Tio. Um, our representative Anthony Delgado has not indicated his support or co-sponsored either, I believe, and it would be really important, and I'm sure all of you will have the want and will to call and ask him to support, or email or write a letter. Um, as we just saw, this is has such a human toll and cost, and be really meaningful um, if we could abolish it. Yes. And if you want to say anything else, Scott, feel free.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up Delgado. He's also my representative, and he hasn't co-sponsored the bills yet. And so, if we could target him, that's going to be really great to do, because we think he's sympathetic to it. And we're hoping that he'll co-sponsor. Not sure why he hasn't. And I think it's also important to bring up that actually the last of the 13 federal executions that happened was a man named Dustin Higgs, and he was actually originally from Delgado's district as well. And Dustin Higgs was also a Black man. So we're hoping that Representative Delgado will have some sympathetic leanings towards co-sponsoring the bills. Co-sponsoring is different than actually voting for it. We're hoping that he'll actually vote for it, but to get co-sponsors ahead of time is always helpful. And I'll mention too that Google sheet that was just sitting in the chat there, we just put a new tab on it for the Senate, because this week the Senate also introduced a companion bill to abolish the federal death penalty. And this week I'm gonna update that with the representatives from the Northeast that have already co-sponsored that bill. So we keep an eye on that too for other actions.
Thank you. Yes, and yes, so please call your representatives. If you are a residential student at Simon's Rock, um, you might be able to find the status of your non-Northeast person just through the House or Senate website. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and leave it to Scott with any final words.
Thanks again, everyone. I know it's a Saturday, so I appreciate you being here. I'm sure there's much more exciting things we could all be doing, but it's important. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry.
All right, take care.